34, heavy with child, and entirely abandoned. Dust choked Beatrice Gallagher as the Union Pacific train hissed away, taking her false husband and her life savings with it. Standing alone on a brutal Wyoming platform, her life was over until a massive shadow fell, a dark voice whispering, "You're mine now." The 14th of October, 1883, Silverton, Wyoming Territory. Soot fell like black snow across the splintered wooden planks of the railway platform. Beatrice Gallagher stood paralyzed, her hands resting protectively over the heavy, swollen curve of her belly. Her lungs burned with the acrid stench of coal smoke, but she couldn't draw a breath. She couldn't blink. She could only stare at the shrinking caboose of the eastbound train as it disappeared into the jagged maw of the distant canyons. He was gone. Nathaniel Prescott was gone. The wind howled down from the Wind River Range, a biting, vicious gale that tore at her modest woolen shawl. At 34 years old, Beatrice had long been dismissed by society as a withered vine, a spinster whose sole purpose had been to nurse her ailing father on their isolated Ohio farm. She had resigned herself to a quiet, lonely fade into obscurity. Then Nathaniel had arrived. He was a traveling merchant with silver on his tongue and gold in his promises. He had spoken of a grand life in the West, of a home built on sweeping plains, of a family. He had courted her with a fierce intensity that blinded her to the shadows in his eyes. They were married by a circuit judge just 3 days after her father was laid to rest. Blinded by the sudden, desperate hope of motherhood and a life she thought she'd never have, Beatrice signed over the deed to the family farm, converting it into a bank draft so Nathaniel could invest in their new empire. Now, she stood on the edge of the frontier, 6 months with child, clutching a frayed carpet bag that contained 2 dresses and a hairbrush. "Ma'am?" Beatrice blinked, the trance breaking. An older man in a striped vest and a visored cap stood a few feet away holding a clipboard. It was Mr. Henderson, the Silverton station master. His face was weathered, his eyes filled with a pity that made Beatrice's stomach churn. "The platform is closing, Mrs. Prescott," Henderson said gently. "Your husband," he said, "you'd be taking the stagecoach south to wait for him while he secured the cattle in Cheyenne. Do you need me to direct you to the boarding house?" A cold dread, sharp as shattered glass, pierced her chest. He said he was going to buy our tickets," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking. "He told me to wait right here by the benches. He took my reticule to pay the clerk." Henderson's face fell. He slowly pulled a velvet pouch from his pocket. "He left this with the telegraph operator. Said it was heavy, and you wouldn't need the burden." Beatrice snatched the pouch with trembling fingers. She yanked the drawstrings open and inverted it over her palm. A pile of rusted iron washers tumbled out, clattering onto the wooden boards. There was no bank draft. There was no inheritance. There was only a piece of folded parchment. She opened it. The handwriting was elegant, mocking in its precision. "A heavy bird cannot fly, Beatrice. I thank you for the funds. The marriage certificate was as forged as the ring on your finger. Do not look for me." Her knees buckled. She hit the wooden platform hard, a muted cry escaping her lips. The baby kicked violently against her ribs, protesting the sudden jolt, a brutal reminder of the life growing inside her, a life tethered to a ghost, born of a lie. She looked down at her left hand. The gold band Nathaniel had slipped onto her finger was already leaving a faint, bruised ring of green on her skin. "Oh, sweet heaven," Henderson breathed, dropping to a knee beside her. "Ma'am, you have no money? No family?" "Nothing," she choked out, the reality crushing her lungs. "I have absolutely nothing. Silverton is no place for a woman alone, especially not in your condition," the station master warned, his voice urgent. "The miners come down from the ridges on Friday nights. They've got silver in their pockets and rot-gut whiskey in their bellies. You can't stay on this platform. The boarding house is $2 a night, but if you don't have it," he trailed off, looking toward the muddy main street. Saloon doors swung on rusted hinges, spilling jangling piano music, and the raucous, violent shouts of desperate men into the freezing twilight. The town was a festering wound of mud, timber, and vice. "I will sit right here," Beatrice said, her voice eerily hollow as she forced herself back up to the bench. I need to think." Henderson hesitated, but the shrill whistle of an incoming freight train called him away. "I'll lock the office at 8, ma'am. Please, seek shelter." Hours bled away. The sun dipped below the mountains, plunging Silverton into a harsh, freezing darkness. The temperature plummeted, turning the mud to ice. Beatrice wrapped her thin shawl tighter, shivering violently. Her mind raced through impossible equations. She couldn't work in a saloon. She couldn't do hard labor. She was 34, pregnant, and penniless in a territory that chewed up strong men and spat out their bones. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, or perhaps just an end to the cold. The sound of heavy, sloshing footsteps pulling through the freezing mud jolted Beatrice awake. She had dozed off, her chin resting on her chest, her body numb from the biting wind. She opened her eyes to the dim, flickering orange light of a nearby street lantern. 3 men were staggering up the steps of the railway platform. They reeked of cheap gin, unwashed bodies, and chewing tobacco. Their clothes were caked in gray mining dust. "Well, well, well," the tallest one slurred, wiping a filthy hand across his mouth. "Look what the Union Pacific left behind. A little stray bird." Beatrice pressed her back against the wooden wall of the station, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid her hand protectively over her stomach. "Leave me be," she said, trying to summon a commanding tone, but it came out as a desperate rasp. "Now, that ain't neighborly," another miner laughed, stepping closer. He had a jagged scar across his chin and missing teeth. "It's freezing out here, darlin'. We got a warm fire over at the bunkhouse. Why don't you come keep us company?" I said, "Stay back." Beatrice grabbed her carpet bag, holding it up like a pathetic shield. The tall miner lunged, his thick fingers grabbing her wrist. Beatrice screamed, yanking her arm back, but his grip was like iron. "Don't fight it, lady. Ain't nobody gonna hear you over the music anyway." Crack. The sound was like a thunderclap, deafening and sudden. The wooden post inches from the tall miner's head splintered, raining sharp shards of pine over his shoulders. The 3 men froze, terror instantly sobering them. "Let her go." The voice didn't come from the street. It came from the shadows at the far end of the platform, a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A figure stepped into the flickering lantern light. Beatrice gasped. He was a mountain of a man, standing well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and imposing. He was draped in a massive coat of dark bear fur, worn leather chaps, and tall, mud-caked boots. A thick, dark beard obscured his jaw, and long, unruly hair fell past his collar. But it was his eyes that held Beatrice captive. They were a piercing, icy blue, striking against the weathered, sun-baked leather of his skin. A jagged white scar cut from his left temple down to his cheekbone. In his massive hands, he held a smoking Sharps buffalo rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at the chest of the tall miner. "Gideon," the scarred miner whispered, his voice trembling. He took a step back, raising his hands. "Gideon Croft, we didn't know she was yours, Croft. We were just checking on her." "You're breathing my air, Wallace," Gideon Croft said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't move an inch, perfectly still like a predator calculating a strike. "Take your filth and walk away, or the next bullet goes through your eye." The 3 men didn't hesitate. They stumbled over themselves, practically falling down the platform stairs as they sprinted toward the safety of the muddy street, disappearing into the chaotic noise of the town. Silence rushed back onto the platform, broken only by the howling wind. Gideon lowered the rifle. He didn't approach her immediately. His intense, pale eyes swept over her shivering form, lingering for a fraction of a second on her swollen belly, then rising to her tear-stained, terrified face. "You're freezing," he stated. "It wasn't a question." "Thank you," Beatrice choked out, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. I have no money to repay you, sir." Gideon slowly closed the distance between them. Up close, he smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and old leather. He loomed over her, a wild, untamed force of nature. "I didn't ask for payment. What are you doing out here?" "Train's gone." "So is my husband," she whispered, the shame burning her cheeks. She looked down at the fake brass ring. "He left me. He took everything." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Name?" "Beatrice. Beatrice Gallagher. Not yours. His." "Prescott," she answered, a fresh tear slipping down her cheek. "Nathaniel Prescott." The change in the giant was instantaneous. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. His knuckles went white as he gripped the barrel of his rifle. A dark, terrifying fury flared in his icy eyes. "Prescott," he repeated, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "Tall man, dark hair, speaks with a silver tongue, and wears a pocket watch with a cracked silver casing." Beatrice stared at him in shock. "How? How did you know?" A grim, humorless smile touched Gideon's lips, not quite reaching his eyes. "Because 3 years ago, Nathaniel Prescott came through the Wind River settlement. He promised my younger sister the world, took her dowry, and left her stranded in a blizzard in Denver. She didn't survive the winter." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. The monster she had married had left a trail of ruined lives. I am so sorry," she whispered. Gideon looked at her, his eyes softening just a fraction as he took in her desperate state. He saw the fake ring. He saw the heavy child in her womb. He saw a woman who had been discarded like trash, just like his kin. He reached down and effortlessly hoisted her heavy carpetbag into one hand. "Stand up," he commanded. "What?" "Stand up, Beatrice Gallagher." She pushed herself up, her legs shaking from the cold and the fear. "Where are you taking my bag?" "You're not staying here," Gideon said, turning toward the tracks where a massive black draft horse was tied in the shadows. "Silverton will eat you alive by morning. You're coming up the mountain with me." Panic flared in Beatrice's chest. "I cannot go into the wilderness with a stranger. I am a respectable woman. I am." Gideon turned back, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He stopped inches from her. The sheer size of him blocked out the wind, creating a pocket of sudden warmth. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed a stray, freezing lock of hair from her cheek. "Out here, a respectable woman alone is just a corpse waiting to happen," Gideon murmured, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble that sent a strange shiver down her spine. He looked deep into her eyes, his gaze locking onto hers with an unwavering intensity. "Prescott left you for dead. I won't. You're mine now. I say what happens, and I say you live." Before she could protest, Gideon swept his arm behind her knees and lifted her into the air as easily as if she weighed nothing but feathers. Beatrice gasped, instinctively throwing her arms around his thick neck. He carried her to the black horse, settling her carefully sideways on the wide leather saddle. He swung up behind her, his massive frame shielding her entirely from the biting Wyoming wind. He wrapped his thick bear fur coat around her trembling shoulders, pulling her back flush against his solid chest. "Hold on," Gideon ordered, taking the reins. As the massive horse turned away from the flickering lights of the corrupt town and began the steep, treacherous ascent into the pitch-black mountains, Beatrice realized she had just traded one terrifying unknown for another. But as she leaned back against the steady, thundering heartbeat of the mountain man, for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. The ghost of Wind River had claimed her, and the night had only just begun. The ascent into the Wind River peaks was a brutal, bone-chilling ordeal. The black draft horse, a massive beast Gideon called Goliath, plowed through snowdrifts that grew deeper with every mile. Beatrice clung to Gideon's broad back, her face buried in the coarse, smelling fur of his bear coat. The biting wind shrieked through the canyon, but against Gideon's chest, she found a strange, radiating heat. Hours passed in a terrifying blur of darkness and howling gales. Just as Beatrice felt her consciousness slipping, her limbs going entirely numb, Goliath crested a steep ridge. Nestled in a shallow, sheltered basin surrounded by towering blue spruce stood a sturdy log cabin. Smoke curled weakly from its stone chimney, a beacon of life in the desolate white wasteland. Gideon dismounted smoothly and reached up, pulling Beatrice down into his arms. Her legs gave out the moment her boots touched the packed snow, but he caught her easily, carrying her over the threshold and kicking the heavy oak door shut against the storm. The cabin was a single large room, Spartan but fiercely clean. Pelts lined the log walls, and a massive hearth dominated the far end. Gideon set her gently in a rocking chair near the fading embers, immediately tossing fresh pine logs onto the coals and pumping a bellows until a roaring fire pushed the freezing shadows back. "Drink this," he rumbled, pressing a tin cup of hot, chicory-laced coffee into her trembling hands. Beatrice sipped the bitter liquid, feeling it burn a path of warmth down her throat. As her vision cleared, she looked around. In the corner sat a delicate spinning wheel and a beautifully carved wooden chest. Atop the chest rested a faded daguerreotype of a young woman with a bright smile and eyes that matched Gideon's. Gideon saw her looking. "Susanna," he said softly, the gravel in his voice softening. "My sister. That chest holds the things Prescott didn't steal. I brought them up here after I buried her in the valley." Tears pricked Beatrice's eyes. "He is a monster. He played me for a fool, Gideon. I gave him the deed to my father's farm, my whole life." "You weren't a fool," Gideon replied, stepping closer to take the empty cup from her hands. "You were lonely. Predators like Prescott, they smell loneliness the way a wolf smells blood on the snow. They use it." He looked down at her swollen belly. "But you're not alone anymore. You rest now." For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the cabin. In that time, Beatrice watched the terrifying mountain man transform. Gideon was gruff, a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He cooked venison stew, he carved extra wood for the fire, and he carefully stepped around her, giving her space. There was a profound, quiet respect in him that she had never experienced from the men in Ohio, and certainly not from Nathaniel. But on the 4th night, the trauma of the betrayal and the freezing ride demanded its toll. Beatrice awoke in the pitch black, a scream tearing from her throat as a blinding, agonizing pain ripped through her abdomen. Gideon was out of his cot in a fraction of a second, lighting a kerosene lantern. "Beatrice, what is it?" "The baby," she gasped, clutching her stomach as another contraction hit her like a runaway train. "It's too early. It's 2 months too early, Gideon." Panic, raw and unvarnished, flashed across the giant's face. He knew the wilderness. He knew how to dress a wound and set a bone. But he was no midwife. Yet, looking at her terrified face, he forced the panic down, replacing it with cold, hard resolve. "Listen to me," Gideon ordered, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand in his massive grip. "I am not going to let you die. And I am not going to let this child die. Do you hear me?" The next 6 hours were a blur of blood, boiling water, and excruciating agony. Beatrice screamed until her voice was gone, squeezing Gideon's hand so hard she felt her own knuckles bruise. The mountain man became her anchor, wiping her brow, murmuring low, steady words of encouragement, never once looking away from her face. Just as the first pale light of dawn broke over the snow-capped peaks, piercing the cabin window, a sharp, reedy cry shattered the heavy silence. Gideon fell back on his heels, his massive hands trembling as he held a tiny, red, screaming infant. He quickly wrapped the boy in a soft woolen blanket he had pulled from Susanna's chest. "A boy," Gideon whispered, his icy eyes glistening with unshed tears. He placed the bundled child onto Beatrice's exhausted chest. "He's small, but his lungs are strong. He's a fighter, just like his mother." Beatrice wept, touching the incredibly tiny fingers of her son. The child was not a burden left by a ghost. He was hers. "Samuel," she murmured, kissing the baby's forehead. "After my father." Gideon smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that completely altered his hardened face. "Samuel. It's a good, strong name." In the quiet dawn, surrounded by the harsh Wyoming winter, a fractured woman, a tiny infant, and a solitary giant formed an unspoken bond forged in blood and survival. Winter surrendered to a vibrant, blooming spring. The snow melted, giving way to fields of wild lupine and Indian paintbrush. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw had occurred. Beatrice had not only recovered, but she thrived. The mountain air brought a flush to her cheeks, and her laughter, once non-existent, now filled the wooden walls. Samuel grew strong, babbling and reaching for Gideon whenever the massive man entered the room. Gideon had become a father in every way that mattered, carving wooden toys for the boy and teaching Beatrice how to shoot a rifle and track game. They had not spoken of the future, nor had they spoken of Nathaniel. The unspoken truth was that Beatrice belonged there. With Gideon, the ghost of her past seemed a million miles away. But the past rarely stays buried. It was mid-May when the violence came to their door. Gideon was down by the creek, hauling water, while Beatrice was inside nursing Samuel. The door burst open with a splintering crash. Beatrice scrambled back, shielding her baby, as two men stepped into the cabin. One was a filthy, heavily armed tracker she didn't recognize. The other wore a tailored suit covered in trail dust, a silver pocket watch gleaming against his vest. Nathaniel Prescott. Well, Nathaniel sneered, his dark eyes sweeping over the rustic cabin before landing on Beatrice. The station master wasn't lying. I thought you'd be a frozen corpse at the bottom of a ravine by now, Beatrice. Yet here you are, playing house with a savage. Get out! Beatrice screamed, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. You have no right to be here! Nathaniel chuckled, though it was a cold, lifeless sound. I'm afraid I have every right. You see, my dear wife, I ran into a bit of a problem in Denver. The bank wouldn't accept the deed transfer for your father's farm. It seems the old fool locked it in a federal trust. It requires your physical signature in front of a magistrate to liquidate. He pulled a folded document and a fountain pen from his coat. So, I've come to collect. Sign the paper, and I'll leave you and the bastard child to your pathetic little life in the dirt. I will never sign anything for you, she spat, her heart pounding furiously. Your real name isn't even Nathaniel. You're a murderer. You killed Susanna Croft. Nathaniel's smile vanished. Croft? You're living with Gideon Croft? He exchanged a nervous glance with the tracker. Rufus, get the gun on her. We force her to sign, and we burn this place to the ground before the giant gets back. Rufus raised his revolver, aiming it squarely at Beatrice's chest. Make it quick, boss. I don't want to mess with Croft. Drop the iron, Rufus. The voice boomed from the open doorway, darker and more terrifying than the winter storms. Gideon stood there, water dripping from the buckets he had just dropped. His eyes were locked on Nathaniel, blazing with a murderous, unholy fury. Rufus panicked. He swung the revolver toward the doorway and fired. The bullet grazed Gideon's shoulder, tearing through the leather coat. But the giant didn't even flinch. Before Rufus could cock the hammer again, Gideon moved with terrifying speed. He hurled a heavy wooden bucket straight at the tracker's head. It struck with a sickening crunch, sending Rufus crashing to the floor, unconscious. Nathaniel drew a small derringer from his vest, his hands shaking violently. Stay back, Croft! I'll kill her! I swear to God I'll shoot her! He pointed the tiny gun at Beatrice. You took my sister, Gideon growled, stepping slowly into the room, seemingly ignoring the gun. You left this woman to freeze to death on a platform. You don't get to make threats anymore. Ezekiel Finch. Nathaniel's eyes widened in shock at hearing his true name. In that split second of hesitation, Beatrice swung the heavy iron fire poker with all her might, striking Nathaniel hard against his knee. He shrieked, the derringer firing a wild shot into the ceiling as his leg buckled. Gideon was on him like a wolf. He grabbed Nathaniel by the lapels of his expensive suit and hurled him across the room. Nathaniel smashed into the heavy oak table, splintering it in two. Before the con man could recover, Gideon's massive boot pinned him to the floorboards. Gideon drew his long hunting knife. He knelt down, pressing the cold steel against Nathaniel's throat. I should carve you into pieces for what you did to Susanna, for what you tried to do to my family. Please, Nathaniel sobbed, the silver tongue finally failing him. Please, I'll leave. You can have her. She was never yours.